Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The night Ezra arrived was the kind of night that makes skeptics into believers and scientists into poets, though neither would admit it come morning. Above the small town where clocks ticked with comfortable predictability and streetlights painted familiar shadows, the sky began to forget its usual rules. The aurora borealis, that distant dancer of the polar regions, had somehow wandered south, far from its appointed stage, to perform above rooftops and elm trees that had never witnessed such impossible beauty. Mrs. Chen was hanging the last of her evening laundry when she first noticed the green shimmer creeping across the darkness like spilled watercolor on wet paper. She called to her neighbor, who called to someone else, and soon half the town stood in their yards with necks craned upward, watching colors that seemed to breathe with their own gentle rhythm. The lights moved differently than any aurora in the textbooks, not in sweeping curtains but in spirals that pulsed and turned as if the sky itself had learned to dance. Nora Blackwood had been the keeper of the old observatory for 37 years, long enough to know the difference between the expected and the extraordinary. She stood at her telescope that night, hands trembling slightly as she tried to make sense of readings that contradicted everything she understood about atmospheric phenomena. The aurora wasn't just beautiful, it was responding. When she adjusted her instrument, the lights seemed to shift in acknowledgement. When she stepped away, they dimmed, as if waiting patiently for her return. Around her, the familiar sounds of evening settled into something deeper than usual quiet. The wind carried the scent of frost and wild mint, and even the crickets seemed to hush, as though someone had placed a gentle hand over the town's small, beating heart. Nora pulled her scarf closer and tucked a thermos under one arm, along with a sandwich wrapped in wax paper that she fully intended to eat, but somehow never would. She wasn't expecting visitors. The observatory was a quiet place even on festive nights, but she kept the lights dim anyway, the way one keeps a library lamp low out of respect for the sleepers of the world. As midnight approached and the neighbors reluctantly returned to their sensible bedtime routines, Nora noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. The wildflower field that stretched between her observatory and the main road, a patch of land that had been brown and dormant for months, waiting for spring's official permission, was suddenly alive with impossible color. Black-eyed Susans, prairie roses, wild lupine, all blooming in the middle of winter, as if someone had whispered the secret of summer into the frozen earth. She walked down the hill with her flashlight, though the aurora provided enough gentle illumination to guide her steps. The flowers bloomed in perfect spirals that mirrored the patterns dancing overhead, their petals unfurling in the chill night air with a beauty that defied every law of seasons and scents. The air smelled of honey and new grass and something else, something that reminded her of the way morning smells, when you wake up knowing something wonderful is about to happen. That's when she heard it. The softest sound, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the unexpected blossoms. A baby's contented sigh, peaceful and sleepy, coming from the very center of the flower spiral. Nora's heart recognized the sound before her mind could process its impossibility. There, cradled by the softest blooms, lay a child no more than a few months old, wrapped in a blanket that seemed to shimmer with the same otherworldly light as the aurora above. The baby's eyes were open, dark and alert, watching the sky with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for much older souls. He wasn't crying or fussing, showed no signs of distress despite being alone in a field in the middle of an impossible night. Instead, he seemed perfectly at peace, as if this strange cradle of flowers and starlight was exactly where he belonged. The aurora pulsed gently overhead, and Nora noticed that its rhythm seemed to match the rise and fall of the infant's breathing, as if they were sharing some ancient conversation in a language older than words. When she knelt beside him, the baby turned his gaze to her face, and Nora felt something she'd never experienced in all her years of studying the cosmos, a sense of recognition that went deeper than sight, deeper than logic, straight to the part of her heart that had always suspected the universe held more tenderness than textbooks could explain. As she lifted the child, the blanket felt surprisingly warm, almost weightless, and the wildflowers around them began to fold their petals, though their vibrant colors lingered like a soft memory against the dark earth. "Hello, traveler," she whispered, and it felt less like an introduction and more like an acknowledgement. The baby's mouth made a small O, as if to answer and then think better of it. Nora laughed under her breath, a sound like a warm blanket settling around them both. As she carried him back up the hill to the observatory, the aurora began its gentle retreat, fading from brilliant banners to soft, translucent veils until only the familiar ancient stars remained. The baby nestled against her, a tiny warm presence that carried the echoes of an impossible night. By the time the first police car arrived, responding to calls about strange lights in the sky, the night looked almost normal again. Just Nora Blackwood, the town's beloved stargazer, holding a child who had somehow appeared in her field like an answer to a question she'd never known she was asking. She would name him Ezra, which means helper in Hebrew, though she wouldn't understand the full significance of that choice for many years to come. That first night, as she settled him in a drawer lined with wool blankets and watched him sleep in the gentle light of her instruments, something decided itself in the room, the kind of decision a person recognizes later, by the way everything that follows seems to fall into place. The telescope pointed toward a region of darkness where new stars learned to be brave, and in the field below, the flowers continued to bloom in their mysterious spirals, creating a pattern that would remain visible from her window for years to come, a daily reminder that some nights, the ordinary world opens its arms just wide enough to let miracles slip through. And so began the story of a boy who arrived with the aurora, whose breathing seemed to match the rhythm of celestial light, and whose presence would teach everyone around him that sometimes the most profound magic happens not in grand gestures, but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the gentle persistence of love that shows up exactly when it's needed. Most the weeks that followed Ezra's miraculous arrival settled into the observatory, like morning light finding its way through familiar windows, gentle, inevitable, and somehow always surprising in its beauty. Nora had expected questions, investigations, the sharp edges of bureaucracy cutting through the soft mystery of that impossible night. Instead, she found that the town seemed to accept Ezra's presence with the same quiet grace they'd shown toward the aurora itself, as if some collective understanding had taken root that certain miracles were meant to be embraced rather than explained. The observatory, which had been Nora's sanctuary of solitude for 37 years, began its transformation into something warmer and more alive. She moved her sleeping quarters to the main floor, creating a nursery corner near the great telescope where Ezra could see the stars through the dome's opening. The space that had once echoed with the solitary sounds of her work, the tick of instruments, the whisper of turning pages, the soft scrape of her chair against wooden floors, now hummed with the gentle rhythms of shared life. Baby bottles warmed beside coffee cups, soft blankets draped over star charts, and lullabies mixed with the ancient music of the spheres. From his earliest days, Ezra was different in ways that went beyond the mystery of his arrival. He rarely cried, and when he did, it was never for long. Instead, he would pause mid-wail, head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. The slight rush of wind that meant clouds were gathering, the almost imperceptible shift in the room's atmosphere that preceded a visitor's knock. He learned the observatory by scent and resonance before he learned it by sight. The iron tang of ladder rungs, the warm smell of oiled wood, the particular quiet that lived in corners where starlight had pooled for decades. It was during these quiet early months that Nora first noticed Ezra's unusual sensitivity to what she privately began calling the emotional weather around him. When she felt frustrated with a particularly stubborn calculation, he would grow restless, his tiny fists opening and closing as if trying to smooth something invisible in the air. When she hummed while organizing her star charts, he would settle into perfect stillness, his breathing deep and content. Most remarkably, when grief visited, as it sometimes did during her late-night vigils, when memories of her departed husband felt especially present, Ezra would make soft, comforting sounds, not crying but gentle vocalizations that seemed designed to offer solace rather than seek attention. By his first spring, when the mysterious spiral of flowers in the field bloomed again exactly as they had the night he arrived, Ezra had developed what Nora came to think of as his weather sense. He could feel the atmospheric pressure of human hearts the way others felt approaching storms. When Mrs. Patterson from the post office visited, still raw with grief from her mother's recent passing, Ezra would reach his small hands toward her with such gentle insistence that she couldn't help but hold him. Within minutes, her tears would shift from the bitter kind that burns to the cleaner sort that brings relief, and she would leave the observatory walking a little straighter, as if some invisible weight had been redistributed. The mailman, Harold, a quiet man who wore grief like a coat he hadn't taken off since losing his son the previous autumn, began timing his deliveries to coincide with Ezra's afternoon naps on the porch. The child would wake as Harold approached, offering whatever treasure was at hand. A smooth pebble, a fallen button, a corner of his blanket still warm from sleep. Harold would accept these gifts with the solemnity of someone receiving medicine, tucking them into his pocket before continuing his route, with steps that seemed somehow lighter. When old Mr. Henley stopped by, gruff and complaining about his arthritis and the state of the world, Ezra would simply gaze at him with those impossibly deep eyes until the man's voice grew softer and his shoulders relaxed. "That boy's got something," Henley would mutter. But he said it the way others might say that sunset's got something, with wonder rather than suspicion. The observatory's evening programs took on a different quality as Ezra grew from infant to toddler. Nora had always been skilled at explaining the technical aspects of astronomy, but now she found herself speaking more about the emotional experience of contemplating the cosmos, the way looking at stars could put daily troubles into perspective, the comfort of recognizing patterns in the vast darkness, the peace that came from feeling connected to something larger than oneself. Ezra would sit in his small chair during these sessions, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed to punctuate her words perfectly, as if he were offering gentle commentary on the mysteries she described. Their evening ritual became a sacred thing, gentle and precise. After supper, simple meals of bread and soup, cheese wrapped like presents, with half a sandwich always placed on the railing, for the sky, because Nora loved to pretend the universe had a small appetite. She would lift Ezra to the eyepiece and let him peer at whatever celestial wonder was visiting that night. It wasn't the view that mattered, but the posture of wonder, the way his small body would grow still with attention, his breathing matching the slow rhythm of the earth's turning. Nora named stars the way some people bless bread, with reverence and intention. "This one is for patience," she would murmur, showing him a faint point above the tree line. "And that cluster there? For all the people who forgot they belonged to something beautiful." Ezra didn't understand the words, but he understood their temperature, the way they warmed the air between them and made the darkness feel less like absence and more like possibility. As language arrived, Ezra collected not nouns but textures of feeling. "Soft," he would say, patting the underside of a low-hanging cloud. "Bright," he would whisper when laughter filled the room. "Heavy," he might note before a visitor admitted something difficult, his small hand reaching out as if to help carry whatever burden was approaching. He asked fewer questions than most children, not from lack of curiosity, but because he seemed to know how to listen for answers without forcing them into words. Visitors began arriving more frequently, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. The Hendersons, who came every clear Friday. Sarah Chen, the librarian who found solace in the stars after difficult days at work. Dr. Martinez, recently retired and struggling with questions about purpose and meaning. They would arrive as individuals and leave as something closer to a community, bound by shared wonder and the inexplicable sense of being truly seen and accepted. It was during one of these evening gatherings that Nora first spoke aloud what she'd been sensing for months. As they sat in comfortable darkness, telescopes trained on Jupiter's moons, Ezra made one of his soft, musical sounds, a gentle note that seemed to harmonize with the night itself. "He's listening," Nora said quietly, surprising herself with the words. "I know it sounds impossible, but I think he understands what we're feeling, not just what we're saying." The silence that followed wasn't awkward but contemplative, the kind of quiet that happens when a truth settles into a room like snow. "Sometimes I think he came to us not just to be cared for, but to help us remember how to care for each other." Dr. Martinez was the first to speak, his voice thoughtful. "I've been coming here for 6 months, and I always leave feeling more peaceful than when I arrived. I assumed it was the stars, but maybe it's something else entirely." He glanced toward Ezra, who was regarding him with that characteristic steady gaze that seemed to see straight through to the tender places where hope and fear lived side by side. As the seasons turned and Ezra grew from toddler to young child, the observatory became known throughout the county as a place where something special happened, not dramatic or flashy, but profound in the way that sunrise is profound, or the way a perfect silence can heal what words cannot touch. People came seeking not answers, but the rare experience of being fully present with their questions, of sitting with uncertainty in a space that felt safe enough to hold whatever they brought. And through it all, Ezra continued to grow into his gift, with the unconscious grace of a flower turning toward light. He learned to read the invisible weather patterns of the human heart, to offer comfort, not through words but through the simple, revolutionary act of witnessing without judgment. The boy who had arrived with the aurora was becoming something the world desperately needed, a gentle keeper of emotional storms, a small lighthouse in the sometimes overwhelming darkness of being human. Late at night, when the last visitors had departed and the dome tracked its slow arc across the star-filled sky, Nora would tuck Ezra into his small bed and whisper the day's observations to him, as she'd once whispered them to the stars. "You're teaching us something, aren't you?" she would say softly. "Something about how healing happens, how peace spreads from one heart to another like ripples on a still pond." And Ezra, already growing heavy with sleep, would make a small sound that might have been agreement, or might have been the simple contentment of a child being loved exactly as he was, in a place where miracles were as natural as breathing, and where the universe revealed its gentlest secrets to those patient enough to listen. By the time Ezra reached his 7th spring, his sensitivity to the emotional weather around him had refined itself into something approaching fluency. He could feel the difference between the sharp chill of fresh grief and the gentler coolness of old sorrow finally finding its way toward peace. He recognized the particular warmth that gathered around people who were falling in love, different from the steady heat of long companionship, and he knew the way hope felt when it was just beginning to stir after a long winter of disappointment. The wildflower field continued its mysterious blooming each year, the spirals of color appearing with the same impossible precision as that first night of his arrival. Ezra had taken to spending his afternoons there, sitting quietly among the blossoms and learning to read the subtle shifts in light and shadow that seemed to correspond with the emotional currents flowing through the town below. Morning light felt different from afternoon light, not just in color but in the way it touched the heart. Dawn carried possibility. Dusk wrapped everything in forgiveness. It was during one such afternoon, when the light fell golden and thick as honey through the apple blossoms at the field's edge, that Luna appeared. She moved through the flowers with the careful attention of someone reading a beloved book, pausing occasionally to study a particular arrangement of petals or the way shadows fell between the stems. She was perhaps 8 years old, with dark hair that seemed to catch and hold the light, and eyes that noticed everything, while appearing to judge nothing. Ezra watched her approach without alarm, sensing in her presence the same quality of gentle attention he'd learned to cultivate in himself. She carried a sketchbook pressed against her chest and moved with the unhurried grace of someone who understood that the best discoveries couldn't be rushed. When she finally settled beside him, among the black-eyed Susans, it felt as natural as sunrise. "They grow in patterns," she said softly, opening her sketchbook to reveal pages filled with spirals, seashells and pine cones, the unfurling of fern fronds, the way water swirled down a drain. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the still air. The same shapes appear everywhere, like the universe is telling the same story in different languages. Ezra studied her drawings with the focused attention he gave to everything that mattered. In her careful lines, he could see not just accuracy but affection, the way someone draws something they truly love. "So you see how things want to be arranged," he said, and it wasn't a question. Luna nodded, turning to a fresh page and beginning to sketch the spiral of flowers around them. "My grandmother taught me that patterns are how the world keeps itself organized. Even when everything looks random, there's usually a shape underneath, holding it all together." Her pencil moved with quiet confidence, capturing not just the arrangement of blooms, but something deeper, the sense that this particular pattern was both accident and intention, chaos organized by invisible rules. They spent that first afternoon mapping the field together, Luna sketching, while Ezra shared what he'd learned about each flower's particular emotional signature. The prairie roses, he explained, held memories of storms weathered and seasons survived. The wild lupine carried the cool patience of early morning, while the morning glories, which shouldn't have been blooming at all in this location, hummed with the kind of contentment that comes from being exactly where you belong, even when you're not supposed to be there. Luna listened with the intensity of someone hearing a new language being born. She began adding small symbols to her sketches, not words but marks that seemed to capture the emotional qualities Ezra described. A tiny spiral for resilience, a series of dots for patience, a soft curve for inexplicable joy. Together, they were creating something that had never existed before, a map of the intersection between mathematical beauty and emotional truth. Their friendship developed with the organic inevitability of seasons changing, each day building naturally on the last. Luna would arrive at the observatory most mornings, drawn not by any formal invitation, but by the same instinct that brings migrating birds to their ancestral roots. She and Ezra would spend hours in companionable exploration, she sketching the patterns she found in everything, from cloud formations to the way light fell through the dome's opening, he reading the emotional atmospheres, that different combinations of weather and time created in the space Nora. Watched their partnership bloom with the quiet satisfaction of a gardener who recognizes that some plants grow better when they're planted together. Luna's presence seemed to amplify Ezra's gifts rather than compete with them. When visitors came to the observatory now, they found not just the gentle comfort of Ezra's empathetic attention, but also Luna's gift for helping them see the underlying order in whatever chaos they were experiencing. The two children developed their own language of shared understanding, built on glances and small gestures rather than lengthy explanations. When Luna grew very still and began sketching rapidly, Ezra knew she was seeing a pattern that would matter to someone who needed it. When Ezra's breathing changed and his attention turned inward, Luna would quietly document whatever was happening around them, creating a visual record of the invisible shifts he was sensing. Their most profound discovery came during a late spring afternoon when storm clouds were building on the horizon and the air felt thick with approaching change. Luna was sketching the spiral formation of the clouds while Ezra sat beside her, unusually quiet and focused. Gradually, they both became aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The emotional atmosphere around them was shifting in the same pattern that the clouds were following overhead. "It's the same spiral," Luna whispered, her pencil moving quickly across the page. "The storm in the sky and whatever's happening in the feeling space around us, they're following the same shape." She showed him her sketch, where the meteorological spiral of the approaching weather system was mirrored by abstract curves that somehow captured the building tension and anticipation in the air itself. Ezra studied the drawing with growing wonder. "It's like the outside weather and the inside weather are connected," he said slowly, "like they're part of the same system, just happening in different places." The realization felt enormous, as if they'd stumbled onto one of the universe's fundamental secrets, that the patterns governing emotional storms might be the same ones that shaped galaxies and seashells and the chambers of the heart. Evening visitors to the observatory began to notice the subtle but profound shift in the atmosphere. Where once they'd found comfort in Ezra's gentle presence and the peace of stargazing, now they discovered something deeper, a sense that their personal struggles were part of larger, more beautiful patterns, that their difficulties followed the same elegant mathematics that governed the movement of planets and the growth of flowers. Dr. Martinez, who had been coming regularly since his retirement, was the first to put words to what many were feeling. "It's as if you're helping us see that our problems aren't just random chaos," he said one evening, studying one of Luna's sketches that seemed to capture the exact shape of his own journey through loss toward renewed purpose. "There's an order to it all, even when we're in the middle of the mess and can't see it ourselves." Luna, now growing more confident in her soft-spoken wisdom, began sharing her observations during the evening sessions. "My grandmother taught me that patterns repeat because they work," she would say, showing a sketch of spiral shells arranged by size. "The same shapes that help a nautilus grow strong help storms form and help feelings move through us. Maybe being confused or sad isn't a mistake. Maybe it's just part of a pattern we can't see all of yet. As summer deepened and the mysterious flowers in the field reached their full bloom, Ezra and Luna spent long afternoons perfecting their collaborative art. She would sketch while he sat in quiet attention, both of them learning to recognize the moments when pattern and feeling aligned in ways that could offer genuine comfort to those who needed it most. They were becoming, without quite realizing it, a new kind of healer, one who worked not through medicine or advice but through the simple recognition that beauty and pain followed the same fundamental rules, and that understanding those rules could transform suffering into something closer to wisdom. The observatory had become something unprecedented, a place where the mathematical beauty of the cosmos met the messy, wonderful complexity of human emotion, where two children with complementary gifts were learning to help adults remember that even their darkest moments were part of something larger and more elegant than they dared to imagine. And as the season turned and the first hints of autumn began to paint the edges of leaves, both Ezra and Luna could sense that their understanding was still growing, still deepening, preparing them for whatever gentle mysteries lay ahead in their quiet, transformative work of helping hearts remember their connection to the vast, patient patterns that held everything together. As autumn deepened and the wildflower spirals began their gentle retreat into dormancy, Ezra's understanding of his gift evolved from simple recognition into something more intentional, though no less gentle. Nora, who had watched his sensitivity bloom with the patience of someone who understood that the most profound abilities ripen slowly, began to share with him and Luna the subtle art she had practiced for decades without ever naming it. She called it making room, the quiet craft of adjusting the visible world to create space for invisible healing. "We don't change the weather," Nora would murmur as she dimmed a lamp or shifted a chair's angle toward the window rather than the wall. "We simply change how we stand beneath it." She taught them that healing often happened in the margins, in the temperature of tea, the angle of light, the particular quality of silence that invited rather than demanded, a door left slightly ajar, a blanket folded within easy reach, the way footsteps could cross a threshold with permission rather than intrusion. Ezra's first conscious attempt to influence the emotional atmosphere taught him more through failure than success ever could. Have Mr. Henley arrived one evening carrying his usual brittle complaints, the air around him sharp with decades of accumulated disappointments. Eager to help, Ezra tried to brighten the space. More lamplight, a cheerful melody hummed under his breath, questions meant to show care but delivered with too much intensity. The brittle feeling only tightened, like wind funneled through a narrow passage. "Too much, boy," Mr. Henley said, his voice rising. "Too much." Nora's hand touched Ezra's shoulder with two fingers and everything slowed. The lamp dimmed a fraction. The dome's opening widened to reveal the blue dusk, and Nora's breathing settled into the unhurried rhythm of a peaceful afternoon. Ezra matched her pace, let his hum soften until it was barely audible, and sat down 2 arms lengths away, facing the same direction as Mr. Henley, rather than directly at him. After a minute that felt like an hour, the old man's shoulders dropped. "Rain in the knees," he muttered, and then, after another pause, "Lost the whistle sound my wife used to make when she pretended to be a kettle." He laughed once, surprised to find the sound still alive in his throat, and the room's pressure eased like a cloud, deciding to drift instead of storm. From that evening forward, Ezra learned to lower the ground beneath people rather than try to lift them up. He discovered that stillness invited stillness, that an honest sigh could open doors more gently than any bright word. His small acts began to lean toward invitation rather than effort, a folded blanket, placed where a hand might reach without thinking, the quiet slide of a mug to the exact spot where someone's gaze had landed, the way he would look at the sky just as a person ran out of things to say. Luna's presence amplified rather than competed with his gift. When the town librarian, Sarah Chen, arrived one afternoon carrying grief for her recently departed cat, a sorrow that felt enormous despite its seeming smallness, Luna quietly began sketching the emotional weather patterns Ezra was sensing. Her drawings captured the tight spirals of stuck pain, then gradually showed them loosening into gentler curves that suggested movement rather than repetition. Ezra sat nearby with an old book of star charts, not reading, But simply being present in the way he'd learned created the most space for healing. The grief didn't disappear, but its sharp edges softened. Sarah found herself noticing dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, like tiny stars, hearing the peaceful sounds of pages turning and pencils moving across paper. When she finally spoke, he was a good cat, always there. Her voice carried the first hint of warmth it had held in weeks. "They leave their paw prints on our hearts," Nora said softly, continuing to polish a lens with unhurried movements. "Sometimes the empty space they leave behind is just a new kind of room, waiting to be filled with memories." Sarah nodded, a single tear tracing her cheek, but this time it felt cleansing rather than bitter. Harold the mailman began timing his deliveries to coincide with the children's afternoon presents, drawn by something he couldn't name but desperately needed. On days when the weight of his own losses made his route feel impossible, Ezra would create small tasks that were just barely larger than necessary. "This string won't stay tied," he'd say, offering a bundle that would have been fine without the extra attention. Harold would nod, straighten his shoulders, and continue his route with steps that carried more purpose. Their evening gatherings evolved into something that felt ceremonial, without being formal. Chairs arranged in a crescent rather than a circle, so no one felt surrounded. Lamps dimmed to preserve the star's authority. The dome tracking its slow arc, while air moved in and out like a sleeping thing. Nora offered tea in mismatched mugs, each one heavy enough to require both hands. Luna set charcoal to paper, with the steady rhythm of someone who trusted the right shapes to emerge. Ezra listened for the moment when a story was ready to turn, and when it arrived, he breathed it wider, like a sail catching a kinder wind. Word drifted beyond the county that something special was happening at the old observatory. Not dramatic transformation, but the gentle rearrangement of inner weather into more livable patterns. People came not to be dazzled, but to be quietly reintroduced to their own capacity for peace. They left notes on windowsills. "Your sky is kind." They discovered that arguments could become firelight when both people agreed to watch the same star without speaking. As winter approached and the mysterious flowers entered their annual rest, Ezra felt the first stirrings of something larger approaching. Not urgency, but permission. The Aurora forecast radio, silent for months, began murmuring the faintest possibility of lights wandering south again. At night, when the observatory emptied and silence held the echo of voices like a shell holds the sea, Ezra practiced moving the weather in his own small way, offering conditions, warmth, softness, to space, and discovering that healing had its own instincts when given a place to land. He was learning that nothing needed to be dramatic to be holy, that the most profound changes happened not through grand gestures but through the patient, persistent practice of creating room for others to remember their own wholeness. And somewhere in this gentle apprenticeship, he felt himself growing into something the world desperately needed. Not a healer who fixed broken things, but a keeper of conditions where broken things could learn to mend themselves. Winter settled over the observatory, like a gentle hand smoothing a blanket, bringing with it the kind of deep quiet that invites the soul to turn inward and listen to its own whispered wisdom. As snow dusted the dormant wildflower field in patterns that echoed the mysterious spirals of Ezra's arrival, he found himself drawn to a new kind of attention, one that looked not just at the present moment's emotional weather, but at the invisible pathways that connected one season of feeling to the next. He was learning to read what he privately began calling the migration routes of the heart. The observatory's warmth felt more precious during these shorter days, and visitors seemed to linger longer, drawn by something deeper than shelter from the cold. Luna, now spending most afternoons curled in the reading corner with her ever-present sketchbook, had begun creating what she called feeling maps, intricate drawings that traced the way emotions moved through people over time, showing not just where they were, but where they were traveling and how they might arrive there with greater grace. Ezra discovered that his sensitivity was evolving from simple recognition into something approaching fluency. He could feel the difference between the sharp chill of fresh grief and the gentler coolness of old sorrow, finally finding its way toward acceptance. He learned to recognize the particular tension that gathered in shoulders before a confession, the almost imperceptible shift in breathing that signaled someone was ready to release a long-held burden, the way hope felt when it was just beginning to stir after a long season of disappointment. These observations began to organize themselves into what he thought of as an internal atlas, not drawn on paper, but mapped in the quiet spaces of his heart. He learned to recognize landmarks in the emotional landscape, the moment when resistance softened into acceptance. The pause before laughter decided it was safe to emerge. The particular quality of silence that meant healing was happening in places too deep for words. Each pattern had its own signature, its own weather system, its own natural rhythm that couldn't be rushed but could be supported. Luna's artistic eye helped give shape to these invisible territories. While Ezra absorbed the feeling of a person's inner climate, she translated it into abstract forms and flowing lines. A tight spiral of angular marks might represent anxiety, gradually unwinding into gentler curves as peace took hold. Jagged, broken lines could show the aftermath of sudden loss, eventually smoothing into undulating waves that spoke of resilience learning to flow around obstacles rather than fight them. Their first real test of this deeper understanding came when Mrs. Patterson returned to the observatory after months of absence. She arrived on a February evening when the stars felt particularly close, carrying herself with the careful posture of someone who had spent a long time learning to walk on ground that no longer felt solid. The death of her mother had been followed by her husband's diagnosis with early dementia, and the emotional weather around her felt like the aftermath of multiple storms, not actively dangerous, but littered with debris that made every step uncertain. Ezra sensed immediately that this was different from the acute grief he'd learned to tend. This was the more complex terrain of layered losses, creating emotional geography that couldn't be navigated with simple comfort. Luna looked up from her sketchbook, recognizing in Mrs. Patterson's hesitant movements the particular pattern of someone trying to find their footing on constantly shifting ground. "I don't know why I came," Mrs. Patterson said, settling into the chair that had somehow become hers during previous visits. "I suppose I hoped it might still feel peaceful here, but I'm not sure I remember how peace feels anymore." Her voice carried the hollow quality of exhaustion that goes deeper than sleeplessness, the kind of tiredness that comes from holding too much weight for too long. Nora continued her evening, routine with unhurried movements, but Ezra could sense her attention focusing like a telescope finding its proper distance. She reached into a small drawer and withdrew what looked like a smooth river stone, placing it gently on the table within Mrs. Patterson's reach. "Sometimes peace isn't a feeling we have to remember," she said softly. "Sometimes it's more like a place we learn to rest, even when we're carrying heavy things." Luna began sketching, her pencil moving in slow, deliberate strokes that seemed to match the rhythm of Mrs. Patterson's breathing. On the paper, shapes emerged that looked like topographical maps, contour lines showing elevation changes, paths winding around obstacles rather than trying to climb over them. As she drew, Ezra felt the emotional atmosphere in the room begin to shift, not toward brightness but toward something more sustainable, the kind of steady, patient strength that allows mountains to weather centuries of storms. "I keep thinking I should be getting better faster," Mrs. Patterson continued, her fingers unconsciously tracing the smooth stone surface. "People say things like, 'At least she's not suffering anymore,' or 'You're so strong,' and I know they mean well, but it feels like they're describing someone else's experience entirely. Like there's a map everyone else is reading that I don't have access to." The truth of her words settled into the room like snow accumulating on a windowsill, quietly, persistently, changing the landscape one small addition at a time. Ezra felt the recognition bloom in his chest. This was what his developing gift was teaching him, that some kinds of healing couldn't be rushed or redirected, only witnessed and supported with the kind of presence that said, "Your pace is the right pace. What if getting better doesn't mean feeling lighter?" Luna asked softly, turning her sketchbook so Mrs. Patterson could see the drawing. Lines that showed not the elimination of difficult terrain, but the development of paths that made that terrain passable. "What if it means getting stronger at carrying what you need to carry? Like how trees don't avoid storms by becoming smaller, but by growing deeper roots." The silence that followed felt different from the empty quiet of loss. This was the fuller silence of recognition, of something important settling into place. Mrs. Patterson studied Luna's drawing with the focused attention of someone seeing their own experience reflected back in a language they hadn't known existed. "Weight isn't going away," she said slowly. "And it wasn't a complaint but a discovery. But maybe I'm getting better at carrying it." She looked around the observatory, at Nora's patient movements, at Ezra's quiet presence, at Luna's gentle documentation of invisible truths. "This place helps me remember that I don't have to carry it alone." Over the following weeks, as other visitors came and went, Ezra's internal atlas grew more detailed and nuanced. Harold the mailman taught him about the geography of anniversary grief, how certain dates on the calendar created their own weather systems, predictable but no less powerful for being expected. Sarah Chen from the library showed him how healing could happen in spirals, circling back through familiar territory, but at a slightly different elevation each time, gradually climbing toward a view that encompassed both loss and gratitude. Luna's visual maps became an essential part of their collaborative understanding. She would sketch the tight, defensive postures that preceded breakthrough, the gradual opening of closed gestures, the way people's relationship to space changed as they moved from isolation toward connection. Her drawings captured not just individual journeys, but the way different people's healing paths intersected and supported each other, revealing the observatory as a kind of emotional watershed where natural healing could find its course. They began keeping what Ezra privately called sighting, stones, smooth pebbles and worn pieces of wood that fit comfortably in a palm, each one chosen for its particular weight and texture. These became gentle anchors for people who needed something solid to hold, while their inner world shifted and settled. A piece of driftwood for someone learning to flow around obstacles, a bit of polished granite for those who needed to remember their own strength, a chunk of rose quartz for hearts that had forgotten how to be tender with themselves. As winter deepened and the aurora forecast began whispering the possibility of another extraordinary night, Ezra felt his understanding crystallizing into something approaching wisdom. He was learning that his gift wasn't about changing how people felt, but about helping them feel how they felt with greater acceptance and skill. The emotional storms would come and go according to their own natural patterns, but people could learn to build better shelter, to read the signs more clearly, to trust in the inevitable return of calmer weather. And in the quiet moments between visitors, as he sat with Luna among their growing collection of feeling maps and weather charts, Ezra began to sense that they were preparing for something larger, not a crisis but an opportunity. The same mysterious forces that had brought him to this place on a night when the sky forgot its usual rules were stirring again, preparing to offer the town another chance to remember what it meant to weather life's storms together, with grace and mutual care and the kind of gentle wisdom that grows only in the soil of shared vulnerability. The field where he'd been found lay quiet under winter's blanket, but the spiral paths showed in the stubble like secret handwriting, reminding him that some patterns persist through every season, waiting patiently for the right moment to bloom again. And somewhere in the deepest part of winter's quiet, he could feel the first stirrings of that familiar electricity, the sense that the sky was learning to dance again, and that when it did, the town would be ready to receive whatever gifts the darkness chose to offer. The signs began arriving in whispers, long before anyone thought to call them signs at all. The Aurora Forecast Radio, which had maintained its respectful silence for nearly 9 years since Ezra's arrival, started crackling with faint possibilities in late February. Solar wind patterns shifted into configurations that made meteorologists pause over their instruments, with the particular stillness of people recognizing something they'd never seen before. Even the migrating birds seemed confused, arriving weeks early and flying in formations that spelled unfamiliar letters against the warming sky. Ezra felt the approaching change first in his dreams, where the familiar patterns of the observatory's emotional weather began stretching and deepening into something more expansive. He would wake with the taste of electricity on his tongue, and the sense that the invisible boundaries between one heart and another were growing more permeable, like ice beginning to thin at winter's end. Luna noticed it too, her sketches taking on a quality of movement and flow that seemed to anticipate something just beyond the edge of the page. It began the way a song begins before anyone hears it, with a change in the air so subtle that only those who had learned to listen with their whole bodies noticed. The snow that lay over the field seemed to exhale, the way a sleeping person does when a dream turns kinder. Wind chimes moved without wind, Cats lifted their heads in unison, and the dome of the observatory tasted the night and found it sweeter than usual. Word spread through the town, with the organic speed of significant news, not through official announcements, but through the kind of excited murmuring that happens when people sense they're about to witness something extraordinary. The observatory began receiving calls from visitors who had felt drawn to return, often unable to explain exactly why. Mrs. Patterson called to ask if she might bring her husband, whose dementia had been progressing, but who still remembered the peace he'd found during their previous visits. Harold asked if he could invite his sister from the next county, who had been struggling since her divorce. By evening, as the first hints of unusual light began gathering on the northern horizon, the observatory and its surrounding field held more people than had ever gathered there before. But instead of the chaos that might have been expected, the atmosphere carried the same quality of gentle anticipation that had always characterized the place. People arranged themselves naturally in the patterns that felt most comfortable, some in small clusters, others in solitary contemplation, all of them somehow oriented toward the sky with the patient attention of flowers turning toward the sun. When the aurora returned, it did so without drama, as if the sky had been practicing all winter to get the entrance just right. No curtains this time, no sweeping grandeur. Instead, the lights emerged as luminous threads crossing in patient arcs, weaving themselves into patterns that felt both foreign and familiar. The colors were different this time, deeper, more varied, including shades that seemed to exist between the usual spectrum rather than within it. The lights moved with deliberate grace, forming patterns that felt both random and intentional, like a conversation in a language everyone could understand, but no one could translate. Under this luminous canopy, something began to happen that none of them had expected, but all of them recognized as inevitable. The usual boundaries between private thoughts and shared experience began to soften, not disappearing but becoming more like curtains than walls, present when needed for privacy, but easily drawn aside when connection was desired. It was what Ezra would later understand as beautiful confusion, not the kind that fractured and broke, but the kind that dissolved boundaries and allowed for a deeper, more profound sense of belonging. Mrs. Chen, the librarian, found herself standing on her porch, humming a tune she hadn't thought of since childhood, when her neighbor, Mr. Henderson, walked by. Instead of his usual nod, he stopped, looked at the sky, and then, with a sigh that seemed to release years of unspoken weariness, confessed, "I miss my dog more than words can say. Mrs. Chen, every night I still look for him by the back door." Mrs. Chen, usually reserved, simply reached out and took his hand, her own eyes welling up with a shared, silent understanding. At the observatory, one young couple who had been on the verge of breaking up stood silently, their shoulders almost touching. The usual tension that Ezra sensed between them was gone, replaced by a quiet vulnerability. The girl turned to the boy, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "I'm just so tired of pretending I'm not scared." The boy, who usually responded with defensiveness, simply pulled her into a gentle embrace, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Ezra moved through the gathering not as a leader, but as a gentle conductor, helping to maintain the delicate balance between openness and safety that made such profound sharing possible. His years of learning to read emotional weather had prepared him for this moment, not to control what was happening, but to help it flow in directions that served everyone's deepest need for connection and understanding. He felt himself growing into something he had never imagined, not just a reader of individual emotional weather, but a keeper of the conditions that allowed community to remember itself. Luna's presence beside him provided the visual documentation of something that might otherwise have seemed too extraordinary to believe. Her sketches captured not faces, but the invisible connections she could see forming between people. Her drawings looked like constellations of human hearts, showing how one person's steadiness could loosen another's fear, how a single honest sentence from the corner could ripple outward and steady a trembling hand across the room. Harold found himself in conversation with a young mother whose grief for her own lost child created an immediate bond of recognition and mutual support. Mr. Henley discovered that his chronic complaints transformed into something approaching wisdom when offered in the context of shared vulnerability, rather than isolated frustration. Mrs. Patterson's husband, who had been largely silent for months, began humming a melody that others gradually joined, creating a wordless song that seemed to harmonize with the aurora's gentle pulsing. As the night deepened and the aurora reached its full magnificence, the observatory field became a kind of temporary village where the usual rules of emotional geography had been gently suspended. Healing happened not through dramatic revelation, but through the simple recognition that everyone present was both wounded and whole, both seeking comfort and capable of providing it. The lights overhead seemed to pulse in rhythm with the collective breathing of the gathering, as if the sky itself was participating in this experiment in radical tenderness. It was a night where truths were spoken not with effort, but with the ease of breathing. The things people usually held close, the hurts and hopes and quiet longings, simply spilled out not as burdens but as offerings. There was no judgment, only a deep, empathetic listening, as if everyone had suddenly remembered a shared language of the heart. The air pulsed with a collective hum of understanding, a sense that for this one night, everyone was walking on common ground, beneath a sky that mirrored their own beautifully confused and open hearts. Nora moved among them like a person arranging seats for a concert where the performers and audience were the same souls, just trading places. She offered warm blankets and cups of spiced cider, her movements unhurried, her eyes reflecting the sky's impossible colors. She didn't try to explain what was happening. She simply held the space for it, understanding that some moments were meant to be experienced rather than analyzed. As the hours passed, the silence was not empty but full, brimming with the shared experience of beautiful confusion, of a night when the world had gently, kindly turned itself inside out to show everyone its tender, beating heart. And Ezra, who had arrived with the aurora 9 years before, understood that this night was not just an event, but a profound lesson in the quiet power of simply allowing things to be, and allowing hearts to open in their own time, in their own way, supported by the patient presence of those who had learned that the deepest healing happens not through grand gestures, but through the revolutionary act of witnessing without judgment. The night was teaching him that his gift had always been meant for something larger than one-to-one healing, that the same forces that had brought him to this place were preparing to use him as a gentle guardian of the spaces where separate hearts could discover their fundamental interconnection without losing their essential individuality. And as the aurora continued its patient dance overhead, he felt the town beginning to remember something it had always known but had temporarily forgotten, that they belonged to each other as surely as they belonged to the stars. As the aurora continued its luminous conversation with the earth below, something inevitable began to happen. People found themselves drawn toward the warm glow spilling from the observatory windows like moths seeking not just light, but sanctuary. The building transformed from Nora's quiet scientific outpost into something that felt more like a hearth for the town's collective heart, a soft-lit harbor where the usual rules of social distance had been gently suspended by the night's beautiful confusion. The field became a living constellation of small gatherings, each group connected to the others by invisible threads of shared vulnerability. But increasingly, people drifted toward the observatory itself, drawn by an instinct deeper than conscious thought. Soon the space that usually held no more than a dozen visitors was filled with a gentle throng. Neighbors who had exchanged only polite nods, now sharing stories that had been buried for years. Strangers drawn by the unusual, atmospheric event, finding themselves welcomed into conversations that felt like homecomings. Ezra moved through this temporary village with the quiet attention of someone who had spent years learning to read the emotional weather, but tonight his role had evolved into something more complex and beautiful. He was no longer just sensing individual atmospheres, but tending to the collective climate, making tiny adjustments that helped maintain the delicate conditions where such profound openness could flourish safely. He nudged a chair 2 inches closer to the window for the man who always felt better with a horizon in view, set a warm mug at the exact spot where someone's gaze had landed, loosened his own shoulders so the air around him would soften and invite others to do the same. Luna moved along the edges like dawn itself, her sketchbook capturing not faces, but the invisible architecture of connection forming around them. Her drawings showed arcs of trust, wavering lines where someone was deciding whether to tell a difficult truth, thicker bands where two different kinds of grief recognized each other and stood quietly back to back. Every so often she would glance up and meet Ezra's eyes, and without words they would adjust the room's atmosphere, dimming a lamp, opening the dome a touch more, until the space matched what the moment was asking for. Near the bookcase, a teenager stood with the tight, sparrow-quick breathing that Ezra recognized as anxiety looking for an exit. He approached carrying a stack of mismatched mugs like a small, merciful assignment. "Would you help me sort these by color?" he asked, as if color were a language and the two of them were fluent. The teenager, River as Ezra would learn when worried eyes searched the room and called the name, nodded and began arranging cups from red to orange to pale amber, then blues from deepest to a whisper of sky. By the time River reached the end of the line, their breathing had found its own steady rhythm. A traveler appeared in the doorway, drawn by the lights and the sound of human voices that asked for nothing. She gave her name as May and carried a violin case whose handle had been mended with careful twine. She stood near the dome, listening to the unpracticed hum rising from the room. People who had forgotten the words but remembered the tune, and raised her instrument to her shoulder. The first note was soft enough not to startle, the second curved around the kettle's gentle sigh, and then she found a melody that seemed to grow from the aurora's own pulse. It wasn't a song anyone knew, yet everyone recognized it as the kind of music that doesn't insist, only offers. Dr. Martinez, who had been coming to the observatory for years, but had never spoken of anything deeper than astronomical observations, found himself sitting with his face turned toward the aurora, his usual composed demeanor giving way to something more vulnerable. "I spent 40 years helping people through their worst moments," he said quietly to the small group that had gathered around him. "I thought I understood suffering, thought I knew how to offer comfort, but when my own wife was dying, I discovered I had no idea how to receive care from others. I kept trying to be the doctor, instead of just being the husband who was losing everything that mattered." The confession settled into the air like morning mist, visible but not heavy. Mrs. Patterson, recognizing a kindred spirit, moved closer with her husband's hand still clasped in hers. "My mother used to say that we're all just walking each other home," she offered gently. "I never understood what she meant until I started losing people. Now I think maybe home isn't a place, but a way of being together." Her husband, whose dementia usually left him confused by complex conversations, looked directly at Dr. Martinez with sudden clarity. "The hardest part isn't forgetting," he said, his voice carrying the weight of lucid moments that came less frequently now. "It's watching the people you love try to hold on to who you used to be instead of loving who you are right now." Harold, who had been sharing his own stories with a young mother whose child struggled with anxiety, turned toward them with recognition shining in his eyes. "My son died angry at me," he said, the words carrying years of accumulated pain. "We'd had a fight about something so stupid, I can't even remember what it was. I keep thinking if I'd just called him back, if I'd swallowed my pride for 5 minutes." The young mother reached out and touched Harold's arm with gentle certainty. "Love isn't about preventing all pain," she said, echoing wisdom that had been hard-won through her own struggles. "It's about being present for whatever comes. Your son knew you loved him, even if the last conversation wasn't perfect." Around them, similar exchanges bloomed with the organic inevitability of flowers opening to sunlight. The aurora overhead pulsed in rhythm with these moments of connection, as if the sky itself was participating in this experiment in radical honesty. May's violin traced ribbons of melody through the conversations, never overwhelming but always supporting, the way good music should. Nora moved through the gathering with the grace of someone who had been preparing for this night her entire life, which in a way she had. There was always one extra blanket draped over her arm, one spare sandwich wrapped in wax paper, for the shy hunger that pretended it wasn't there. She placed a half sandwich on the windowsill, for the sky, she explained to a newcomer, who smiled without understanding, and then somehow did understand. The kettle sang at a volume that never interrupted, and the tea was always at that temperature that invited both hands to wrap around the warmth. As the night deepened, the conversations evolved from individual sharing into something more collaborative. People began offering each other practical wisdom gleaned from their own journeys through difficulty. Mrs. Chen demonstrated the breathing technique that helped her through anxiety. Mr. Henderson showed the gentle stretches that eased his arthritis. Sarah from the library shared the titles of books that had served as lifelines during her darkest periods. The usual barriers, age, social status, the careful distances people maintained in daily life, dissolved as easily as sugar in warm water. Young people found themselves naturally included in conversations with elders who had decades of experience navigating life's challenges. River, the anxious teenager, was soon deep in conversation with Mr. Henley about the way fear could masquerade as anger. The old man's usual complaints transformed into something approaching teaching as he shared what he'd learned about the difference between protective walls and healthy boundaries. Ezra felt his understanding crystallizing as he witnessed these exchanges. This was what his gift had been preparing him for, not just the ability to sense individual emotional weather, but the capacity to help maintain the conditions where people could safely share their deepest truths with each other. He was learning that healing often happened not through expert intervention, but through the simple recognition that everyone present was both wounded and wise, both seeking comfort and capable of offering it. As dawn began to hint at the eastern horizon and the aurora slowly faded to whispers of color, the gathering didn't disperse so much as gently transition. People exchanged contact information, made plans to continue conversations, offered practical help with the everyday challenges that had been shared in the darkness. The field began to empty, but the connections formed during the night remained, creating an invisible network of mutual support that would continue long after the last traces of unusual light disappeared. From the sky, Luna closed her sketchbook on drawings that captured the night's invisible architecture of connection, not just individual healing, but the birth of something larger, a community that had remembered not just that people need each other, but that they're capable of being there for each other in ways that actually help. And Ezra, who had spent the night serving as a gentle guardian of the conditions that made such profound sharing possible, felt himself settling into a deeper understanding of his purpose. The boy who had arrived with the aurora was becoming exactly what the world needed. Not someone who healed people individually, but someone who helped create and maintain the spaces where people could heal each other through the simple, revolutionary act of being genuinely present for one another's truth. The night had taught them all that the most profound transformations happen not through grand gestures, but through the patient, persistent practice of showing up for each other with open hearts, creating room for whatever needed to be shared, witnessed, and gently held in the spacious silence between one breath and the next. Morning arrived the way healing arrives, not announced but recognized, settling into the spaces between heartbeats, with the gentle inevitability of seasons changing. The aurora retreated in whispers rather than fanfare, its impossible colors softening to translucent veils before dissolving into the familiar blue of ordinary sky. But the air itself seemed different now, charged not with electricity, but with the quieter energy of hearts that had been deeply seen and genuinely accepted. The observatory held the night's warmth like cupped hands holding water, and people moved through the space with the careful attention of those who understood they were carrying something precious. The usual boundaries between strangers and neighbors had returned, but gently, like curtains drawn for privacy rather than walls built for protection. Ezra felt the shift in his bones, the beautiful confusion lifting as naturally as morning mist, leaving behind changed ground. He moved among the lingering visitors with the same quiet attention he'd maintained throughout the night, but his role was evolving from conductor to keeper of integration. This was the delicate hour when doubt could arrive like unexpected weather, when the harsh light of ordinary consciousness might try to dismiss what had happened as mere sentiment or wishful thinking. His gift now was to help people carry the night's truths across the threshold into their everyday lives, without losing their essential power. "Before you return to the world," he said softly, to the small group still gathered near the dome, "take something to carry with you. Not as proof, but as companionship." He offered what he and Nora had come to call sighting stones, smooth pebbles and worn pieces of wood, each chosen for its particular weight and warmth. Dr. Martinez accepted a piece of river-polished granite, solid and enduring. River, the anxious teenager who had found unexpected peace in sorting colors, chose a small piece of rose quartz that seemed to pulse with gentle light. Luna appeared beside him with her sketchbook, now thick with the night's invisible architecture. "I've been thinking," she said to River, who lingered near the window with the particular hesitation of someone not ready to return to a world that might not understand what they'd experienced. "Would you like to learn to draw feeling maps? Sometimes having a way to make the invisible visible helps when everything gets overwhelming again." River's face brightened with the recognition that passes between people who have found exactly what they didn't know they were seeking. "Could you teach me to see patterns the way you do?" they asked, and Luna nodded, understanding that teaching was simply another form of healing, another way of creating the conditions where people could discover their own wholeness. Near the door, Dr. Martinez and Harold found themselves in conversation that would have been impossible just hours before. "What you said about not knowing how to receive help," Harold began, his mailman's efficiency replaced by something more tentative but genuine. "I think that's why I keep everyone at arm's length. If I don't let people close enough to help, I can't disappoint them by needing too much." Dr. Martinez looked at him with the particular recognition that passes between travelers who discover they're walking the same difficult path. "I spent 40 years being the helper," he replied quietly. "I thought that was my value, what I could do for others, learning to just be present with my own pain, to let others witness it without trying to fix it. That was harder than any diagnosis I ever had to make." Their conversation continued as they walked toward the parking area, and Ezra felt a deep satisfaction watching two people who might never have spoken beyond polite greetings, now sharing the kind of mutual support that could sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. This was what the night had been teaching, that healing wasn't something that happened to people individually, but something that emerged from the spaces between hearts when those hearts were brave enough to be genuinely present for each other. Mrs. Patterson helped her husband into their car with the patient tenderness that had characterized their relationship throughout his illness. But there was something different now, a quality of peace that hadn't been there before. She paused before closing his door, looking back toward the observatory where small groups were still saying goodbye with the reluctance of children leaving a playground. "I feel like I understand something I didn't before," she said to Nora, who had appeared beside her with the quiet timing of someone who sensed when words needed witnessing. "All this time I've been trying to hold on to who he used to be, fighting the changes instead of learning to love who he is right now. Last night, watching everyone accept each other exactly as they were, it showed me something I'd forgotten about love." As the field gradually emptied and cars pulled away carrying their passengers back to the ordinary world, Ezra stood among the dormant wildflower spirals with Luna, both of them understanding that something fundamental had shifted. The night of beautiful confusion had planted seeds that would grow in their own time, spreading the understanding that healing happens not through dramatic intervention, but through the patient, persistent practice of showing up for each other with open hearts. "Do you think it will last?" Luna asked, but her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Ezra felt the truth settling in his chest like a seed finding fertile ground. "Not the way it was last night," he said slowly. "But something's changed. People remember now what it feels like to be truly seen and accepted. Once you remember that, you start looking for ways to create it again." He could sense it already, in the way Mrs. Chen had invited River to visit the library whenever anxiety felt overwhelming, in Dr. Martinez's quiet plan to start a weekly gathering for people navigating loss, in Harold's decision to actually listen when people answered his polite inquiries about their day. The night had taught them all that the most profound transformations happen not through grand gestures, but through the gentle, persistent practice of creating room for whatever needed to be shared, witnessed, and held in the spacious silence between one breath and the next. As they walked back toward the observatory, where Nora was already preparing for whatever visitors the day might bring, Ezra felt himself settling into a deeper understanding of his purpose. The boy who had arrived with the Aurora was becoming exactly what the world needed. Not a healer who fixed broken things, but a guardian of the spaces where broken things could learn to mend themselves through the simple, revolutionary act of being witnessed and accepted exactly as they were. In the weeks that followed the night of beautiful confusion, The town began to reveal the quiet miracle of how healing spreads when it's given permission to move naturally through a community. The changes weren't dramatic. No headlines announced the transformation. No outside observers would have noticed anything particularly remarkable. Instead, the shifts happened in the spaces between official moments, like morning light finding its way through curtains, softening everything it touched without announcing its arrival. Ezra discovered that his understanding had evolved once again, from guardian of a single sacred space to something more like a gentle meteorologist of the town's emotional climate. He could feel what he privately began calling cascade healing, moments when one person's breakthrough created conditions for another's, like dominoes falling in slow motion across the landscape of human connection. The ripples of the aurora night spread outward in patterns that reminded him of Luna's drawings. Not straight lines but spirals and curves, touching lives in ways that seemed random but followed their own deeper logic. The grocery store checkout line, once a place of hurried impatience, now held moments of quiet camaraderie. A shared sigh over rising prices might lead to a brief, honest exchange about life's burdens, sometimes even a spontaneous offer of help. The coffee shop rearranged its tables to encourage connection rather than isolation, and a bulletin board appeared where people could offer everything from rides to medical appointments to homemade soup for anyone going through difficult times. At the library, Mrs. Chen began what she called quiet hour on Wednesday afternoons, not enforced with shushing, but invited by a sign the children had painted. A crescent moon, a book and the words "We're listening." People came and sat without agenda, some reading, some staring out the window at cloud formations, all of them somehow participating in a collective practice of peaceful presence. River started showing up with Luna, sketchbook open, learning the language of patterns that Luna had been cultivating since her first day in the wildflower field. The thing about anxiety, River explained during one of these sessions, their voice carrying the hard-won wisdom of someone who had learned to dance with their own difficult feelings, is that it's usually trying to protect you from something. But it's like having a smoke alarm that goes off when you burn toast. The warning system is working, but it's not calibrated right. Learning to read the patterns helps you figure out when it's a real fire and when it's just burnt breakfast. Dr. Martinez, true to the promise that had settled in his heart during the aurora night, started a weekly gathering he called wayfinding, not for formal discussions or lectures, but for the kind of honest sharing that the night had made possible. Folding chairs faced a window rather than each other, a choice that made confessions feel less like performances and more like shared weather. People took turns holding a sighting stone while they spoke, a simple ritual that told their nervous systems it was safe to be honest. "I'm learning that grief isn't something you get over," Dr. Martinez shared during one session, his medical training finally integrated with his personal experience of loss. "It's something you grow around. Like a tree growing around a fence. The fence doesn't disappear, but it becomes part of the tree's story, part of what makes it strong and uniquely shaped." Harold's mail route had transformed from mere delivery into a network of small, meaningful connections. He would pause to check on elderly residents who hadn't collected their mail in a few days, carry groceries up difficult stairs without being asked, and somehow always arrive with exactly the right words when someone was having a particularly difficult day. In his pocket, he carried smooth pebbles that Ezra had given him. Not gifts exactly, but gentle reminders of the comfort that could be found in simply holding something solid and real. The observatory itself had become something unprecedented, not just a place people visited during crises, but a regular part of the town's rhythm. Luna had established what she called pattern sessions on Tuesday evenings, teaching anyone interested to create their own feeling maps and recognize the shapes that emotions make as they move through time. Her role had evolved from student to teacher, her artistic eye helping others see the underlying order in whatever chaos they were experiencing. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Clara arrived, a young woman whose face was etched with grief so fresh and sharp that Ezra could feel it like a physical ache in the air around her. She had lost her younger brother suddenly, and the world felt like a place of raw edges and unbearable silence. She had heard about the observatory, about the kind sky and the people who listened, and had driven for hours, drawn by a desperate, nameless hope. Clara sat in the quiet corner that seemed to arrange itself naturally for such moments, clutching a faded photograph of her brother. Ezra sensed the tight knot of anger and sorrow in her, the feeling that the universe had played a cruel trick. He didn't try to offer words, knowing they would feel hollow. Instead, he simply sat nearby, quietly polishing the lens of a small telescope, letting the rhythmic, gentle motion create a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of her grief. Luna, observing Clara's posture with the artist's eye she'd developed for reading invisible weather, began to sketch, not of Clara directly, but of the way light fell across the room, creating pockets of shadow and pools of illumination. Her lines were soft, fluid, capturing the movement of dust motes in the sunbeams, the gentle sway of a curtain in an imperceptible breeze. After a long silence, Clara finally spoke, her voice thin and reedy. "Everyone keeps telling me it will get better. That time heals. But I don't want to heal. I don't want to forget him. It feels like if I heal, I'm betraying him." Nora, who had been quietly tending to a small indoor plant with movements that seemed slightly more deliberate than usual, paused. "Grief isn't a wound we forget," she said softly, her voice carrying the deep resonance of someone who understood the landscape of loss. "It's more like a river that changes course. It carves a new path through us, and sometimes it feels like it's taking everything. But eventually, the banks grow green again, and the water still flows, carrying everything that was, everything that is, and everything that will be." Ezra felt the truth of Nora's words settle into the room like snow accumulating on a windowsill, quietly, persistently, changing the landscape one small addition at a time. He noticed the way Nora folded her scarf a little slower than usual, the way she paused at the bottom of the stairs, as if listening to something only she could hear. Nothing dramatic, just autumn being honest about its gradual approach. "A new path," Clara whispered, her voice still fragile but holding a hint of curiosity. "So it's not about letting go of him, but about finding a new way to carry him." "Sometimes," Ezra said gently, "healing isn't about closing a door, but about learning to live in a house with more rooms. Rooms for joy and rooms for sorrow, and rooms for all the memories that keep our loved ones close, even when they're no longer physically here." Clara stayed until dusk, not speaking much more, but simply sitting in the quiet presence of people who understood that healing was a process of integration, not eradication. When she finally left, she carried a small, carefully folded drawing from Luna, a sketch of a river carving its way through a landscape, with new green shoots emerging along its banks. As evening settled over the observatory and the familiar routine of stargazing began, Ezra felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had grown into their purpose. The ripples continued to spread, each small act of kindness, each shared moment of vulnerability, weaving itself into the fabric of the town. He was learning that the night of beautiful confusion hadn't ended. It had simply moved indoors, into the quiet spaces of people's hearts, continuing its gentle work of reminding everyone that they belonged to each other. The field where he had been found lay quiet in the gathering darkness, but the spiral path showed faintly in the stubble, like secret handwriting, reminding him that some patterns persist through every season, waiting patiently for the right moment to bloom again. And somewhere in the deepest part of evening's quiet, he could sense the next lesson approaching on soft feet, not urgent but patient, like a season preparing to turn with all the grace and inevitability of love, learning to hold whatever comes. The lesson arrived the way seasons change, so gradually that Ezra didn't recognize it at first, mistaking the subtle shifts for temporary weather rather than the deeper transformation they actually were. Nora began pausing longer at the top of the stairs, not from breathlessness, but as if listening to something just beyond hearing. Her hands lingered on familiar objects with the particular tenderness of someone saying gentle hellos that might also be goodbyes. The emotional atmosphere around her was shifting from the steady warmth of long companionship towards something more complex, gratitude mixed with anticipation, love deepened by the knowledge of its temporary nature. "I've been thinking about transitions," Nora said one evening as they sat in their usual contemplation of the stars. Her voice carried the same peaceful quality it always had, but underneath, Ezra could hear the particular music of someone who had made peace with impermanence. "How the most important. Changes happen so gradually, we barely notice them until we look back and realize everything has shifted, Luna looked up from her sketchbook where she'd been drawing the patterns of light and shadow that moved across Nora's face. "Like how the seasons don't really have edges," she said softly. "Summer doesn't end on a specific day, it just gradually becomes autumn until one morning you realize everything is different." The conversation that followed unfolded with the organic inevitability of water finding its course. There was no dramatic announcement, just the gradual understanding that Nora was preparing to pass the observatory's care into younger hands. "You've been learning this work your whole life," she told Ezra, her words carrying the weight of recognition rather than instruction. "Not just the technical aspects of astronomy, but the deeper practice of creating spaces where people can remember their connection to something larger than their immediate troubles." Over the following weeks, their evening routines took on the quality of a gentle apprenticeship. Nora showed him the subtle arts of maintaining the observatory's emotional climate, how the angle of lamplight could invite confidences, when to offer tea, and when to simply sit in companionable silence, the way to adjust the dome's opening so that the sky felt vast enough to hold whatever someone needed to release. "The most important thing," she said one evening, "is to remember that you're not responsible for fixing anyone. Your job is to maintain the conditions where people can heal themselves, where they can remember their own wholeness. Like tending a garden, you don't make the flowers grow, you just make sure they have what they need to grow themselves." The town seemed to sense the approaching change, without anyone making formal announcements. Visitors began arriving with small offerings, hand-knitted scarves, homemade preserves, books of poetry with meaningful passages marked. Dr. Martinez brought a leather-bound journal filled with wisdom from his wayfinding gatherings. Mrs. Chen contributed letters from her library bulletin board. Harold arrived with a wooden box of smooth stones, each chosen for its particular weight and warmth. "Sighting stones," he said, using the term Ezra had taught him, for when people need something solid to anchor to while their inner world shifts. As winter approached, Nora spent longer periods in quiet contemplation, not from fatigue but from what seemed like deep listening, as if she were having conversations with the building itself, sharing 37 years of accumulated wisdom about creating sanctuary for wounded hearts. She began leaving notes in the margins of star charts, not about coordinates but about the conditions that let wonder arrive. "If someone is crying, lower the light by a thumb width. Cold hands. Heavy grief. If the joke lands badly, let the kettle be the one who laughs." "I used to think the point was the stars," she said during one of these quiet interludes. "Then I thought the point was the people who came to look at them. But it's neither, and it's both. The point is the distance between the two, and the bridge we make when we look together." Her final weeks were characterized not by decline, but by distillation, as if she were concentrating all her years of gentle wisdom into its most essential form. She wrote letters to people she'd never met, tucking them into books and leaving them where they might be found by whoever needed them most. Each letter was a small invitation to notice the extraordinary tenderness within ordinary moments. One afternoon, as they sorted through old photographs, she held up a picture of herself as a young woman. "See, Ezra, the same light that was in my eyes then is still here. It just learns to express itself differently over time." She looked at him with eyes clear and full of ancient knowing. "Your job is to keep that light alive, not just in yourself, but to help others find it in themselves too." When she passed peacefully, in her sleep, with the dome open to the stars, the aurora appeared again, not dramatically but gently, like a soft benediction painted across the winter sky. Ezra woke to find her gone, but the room filled with a peace so profound it felt like a presence rather than an absence, as if her love for the place had somehow become part of the building's permanent atmosphere. The funeral was small but deep, held in the observatory with the dome open and chairs arranged so everyone could see the sky. People shared stories not of loss but of transformation, speaking about how Nora's patient presence had helped them remember their connection to something larger and more enduring than their immediate troubles. Standing in the field where he'd been found 18 years earlier, Ezra understood that the circle was completing itself beautifully. The woman who had taken him in had taught him everything about creating conditions where healing could happen naturally. Now it was his turn to carry that work forward, to be a gentle guardian of the spaces where separate hearts could discover their fundamental interconnection. The wildflower spirals lay dormant under winter's blanket, but their patterns remained visible, reminding him that some things persist through every season, waiting patiently for the right moment to bloom again. And somewhere in winter's quiet, he could feel the next chapter beginning, not with drama, but with the same gentle inevitability that had characterized every important transition in his life, like love learning to hold whatever comes with grace, and the kind of patient wisdom that grows only in the soil of shared vulnerability. Tomorrow he would unlock the observatory at the usual hour, trim the lamps to their soft level, and leave the door slightly ajar, not to invite drama, but to welcome whatever honest weather arrived. When someone stepped through, unsure of why they had come, he would do what Nora had done for him from the very beginning. He would make room. Morning arrived the way Nora had taught him it would, quietly, with the patient certainty of light that knows how to find its way through familiar windows. Ezra unlocked the observatory and let his hand rest a moment longer than usual on the smooth brass key, feeling the weight of transition settle into his bones like morning mist finding its place among the trees. The air inside held something new, not emptiness where Nora's presence had been, but a deeper spaciousness, as if her love for this place had become part of the building's permanent atmosphere. He moved through the morning rituals with hands that remembered her teachings, but everything felt different now, expanded, like a song being played in a larger room where new harmonies became audible. The kettle found its gentle murmur, the lamps trimmed themselves to their soft invitation, and the dome remained open to a sky that seemed both vast and intimately familiar. When he placed the first sandwich of the day on the windowsill for the sky, the gesture felt less like continuing tradition and more like accepting inheritance. Luna arrived as the sun reached the wildflower field, carrying 2 mugs of herbal tea and the quiet understanding that some transitions require the presence of those who love us most. They sat in comfortable silence, watching dust motes move through slanted light like tiny constellations, practicing their formations. Neither felt the need to speak about what was ending or beginning. The observatory itself seemed to be breathing differently, settling into its new chapter with the same organic inevitability that turns winter into spring. She knew, Luna said softly, her voice carrying the weight of recognition. She spent years preparing you, teaching you to read not just the sky but the spaces between people's words. Together, they began the gentle work of making the observatory their own, while honoring everything Nora had cultivated. Luna's feeling maps found homes on the walls, not as decorations, but as visual meditations that helped visitors recognize the patterns in their own emotional weather. Ezra arranged small bowls of sighting stones in corners, where reaching hands might discover them without thinking, each stone chosen for its particular weight and the way it settled into a palm seeking comfort. The first real test of his new role arrived when River appeared in the doorway one evening, carrying anxiety wounds so tightly that every breath seemed like an effort. They stood at the threshold with the particular stillness of someone who had learned not to trust their own nervous system, eyes searching Ezra's face as if trying to determine whether this sanctuary remained safe under its new keeper. "Everything feels too bright," River said, their voice thin as paper. "Like someone turned up the volume on the whole world, and I can't find the dial to turn it back down." Ezra felt the familiar recognition bloom in his chest, but this time it carried new weight, the understanding that his response would help determine not just River's evening, but the observatory's future as a place of healing. He moved with the unhurried grace Nora had taught him, dimming the lamps to their softest setting and opening the dome, just enough to let in the sound of evening wind moving through. The field where he'd been found 20 years before. "Would you help me sort the star charts?" he asked, offering what appeared to be a simple task, but was actually an invitation into the kind of focused attention that could interrupt anxiety's endless spiral. "They've gotten mixed up, and I can never remember which constellations belong to spring." As River's hands found their rhythm among the familiar papers, sorting winter stars from spring stars, northern constellations from southern ones, their breathing began to match the unhurried pace of the work. Luna, understanding without words, began sketching the tight spirals that seemed to mirror River's internal state, her pencil moving with the steady rhythm of someone creating visual anchor points in choppy emotional waters. "I keep thinking I should be better at this by now," River said after their shoulders had finally dropped. Like there should be some point where anxiety just stops being something I have to carry. Luna looked up from her drawing, where the tight spirals had gradually loosened into gentler curves. My grandmother used to say that some people are like weather stations, she offered quietly. We feel the atmospheric pressure changing before the storm arrives. It's not a flaw, it's information. The trick is learning to read your own weather reports instead of being surprised by them. The conversation that followed was exactly what Nora would have encouraged, not advice-giving or problem-solving, but the kind of gentle witnessing that allowed River to discover their own wisdom. They talked about the difference between managing anxiety and befriending it, about learning to recognize the early warning signs before the spiral tightened beyond easy unwinding. What if, Ezra said, handling a chart of the summer sky with the same careful attention he'd learned to give to fragile hearts. Instead of trying to eliminate the anxiety, we focused on building your capacity to dance with it. Like learning to waltz with a difficult partner instead of trying to make them leave the dance floor. Over the following weeks, as word spread that the observatory remained a place of sanctuary under its new guardians, Ezra and Luna developed their collaborative approach to creating healing space. They learned to work together like musicians who had found their rhythm, Luna's visual mapping of emotional weather, complementing Ezra's intuitive reading of atmospheric conditions, both of them maintaining the delicate balance between offering comfort and allowing space for whatever needed to emerge. They created new offerings that felt like natural growth from what Nora had tended. Tuesday evenings became Drawing the Weather, where Luna taught visitors to sketch the flow of their days in simple lines, jagged marks for friction, soft curves for ease, helping them recognize that feelings had shapes and could be navigated. Friday nights evolved into Open Orbit, gatherings where people could step into a crescent of chairs facing the window and share one line about their week. No responses required, just the practice of letting a sentence be exactly as big as it needed to be. Dr. Martinez continued his wayfinding gatherings, now often held in the observatory's main room, where the vastness of the cosmos lent natural perspective to life's challenges. Harold, the mailman, became an unofficial ambassador, gently guiding newcomers who seemed lost or overwhelmed. You look like you could use a cup of tea and a quiet sky, he would say, and people would follow him, sensing in his steady presence the same grounded comfort they found in the observatory itself. As the seasons turned and their partnership deepened, Ezra and Luna's relationship evolved with the quiet inevitability of two rivers finding their way to the same sea. Their shared purpose, their complementary gifts, and their unwavering commitment to creating spaces of healing wove them together in a bond that felt both ancient and ever new. They moved through the observatory with silent synchronicity, each anticipating the other's needs. Their lives intertwined in a dance of gentle support and mutual understanding. Their love story wasn't one of grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but of shared silences, knowing glances and the profound satisfaction of building something beautiful together. When Luna began leaving small sketches tucked between Ezra's star charts, drawings of his hands as he worked, the way light fell across his face during evening, observations, he understood, these as love letters written in the language. They both spoke fluently, the vocabulary of careful attention and tender witness. One evening, as they closed the observatory after a particularly full day, Ezra stood by the telescope, looking out at the field where he had been found. The mysterious wildflower spirals, now dormant under winter's blanket, still held the echoes of his impossible arrival. He felt Nora's presence not as absence, but as a guiding warmth, a blessing on the work they were carrying forward. She would be proud, Luna whispered, coming to stand beside him, her hand finding his with the natural ease of water, finding its level. Ezra squeezed her fingers gently, feeling the truth settle in his bones like a seed finding fertile ground. She taught me that pride isn't the point, he replied. The point is the work itself, the work of making room, the work of helping people remember that they belong to something beautiful, even when they feel lost. As winter deepened and the aurora forecast began its familiar whispers of possibility, Ezra felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had grown into their purpose. The observatory had become something unprecedented under their care, not just a place where people came during crises, but a regular part of the community's emotional infrastructure, a lighthouse for hearts learning to navigate their own weather systems with greater skill and compassion. The boy who had arrived with the Aurora had become exactly what the world needed, not a replacement for what had been lost, but something new and equally precious, a keeper of conditions, where people could remember their fundamental interconnectedness and their own capacity for resilience and grace. And in the quiet hum of the observatory, under the vast patient gaze of the stars, he knew that his life's work was only just beginning. Guided by the light of the cosmos and the gentle wisdom that grows only in the soil of shared vulnerability, can mutual care. Spring arrived in a series of small permissions, drips from the eaves that learned to sing again, the field loosening its frozen breath, the way visitors shrugged their coats off 1 week earlier than last year without remarking on it. With the thaw came young people, drawn not by formal announcements, but by rumors that the observatory was a place where feelings were allowed to have shapes and names without being forced into tidy conclusions. They arrived in pairs and in ones, with backpacks and instruments and notebooks full of unruly thoughts that needed a quiet sky to sit under. Ezra learned quickly that guiding was less about speaking and more about shaping air. He adjusted lamps for softness and left chairs slightly askew so they didn't feel like tests to be passed. He and Luna created a rhythm that held everything gently. She would offer a pencil and an empty page. He would offer a sighting stone and a shared horizon. They called nothing a curriculum, but patterns formed anyway, like constellations appearing not because anyone commanded them, but because they were already there. River was the first to cross the threshold from student to guide, returning to the observatory as a young adult, with the particular blend of hard-won wisdom and gentle vulnerability that comes from learning to dance with one's own difficult feelings. They had not forgotten the lessons learned in childhood, nor the tools Luna had given them for mapping their internal landscape. But adolescence had brought its own unique storms, the bewildering currents of identity, the pressure to conform, the fierce desire to belong while fiercely resisting definition. One afternoon, a boy named Jonah arrived, shoulders tight, jaw locked, refusing tea but circling the kettle the way a skittish animal circles a pond it longs to drink from. Ezra could feel the static of panic in him, sharp and prickly, and he moved with practiced care, letting silence open like a path. Before he could decide how to invite, River was already there, placing 3 mugs on the table, one empty, one filled with hot water, one with tea brewed to a pale gold. "When it's loud inside," River said, showing Jonah the 3 cups as if revealing a secret compass. "I start with simple choices. I don't have to decide everything, just this, empty, warm, or warm in flavor. If I can choose a cup, I can probably choose a chair. If I can choose a chair, I can probably choose to breathe with someone for a minute." Jonah chose warm and flavor. His shoulders didn't drop so much as stop climbing. Luna sketched the air around them, lines tight at first and then loosening like coils released one turn at a time. Ezra watched, pleased to feel himself unnecessary in the best way. This, too, was Nora's teaching. Create conditions where helping could happen among peers, then step far enough back to be ready without being in the way. Word of River's compass spread in the quiet manner of trustworthy news. Others came with their own small storms. A girl named Mina, who slept with the light on because darkness echoed. A pianist named Theo, whose hands shook before performances though he loved music with his whole being. A teenager called Ash, who mistook anger for strength until they learned to separate the voltage of fear from the grounding of truth. Each one brought a piece of weather the others could recognize. They became, without fanfare, a loose circle that met on Thursday afternoons and called itself Inner Navigation. Not because it sounded official, but because the name felt like a handrail in a stairwell. The practices they found together were simple and honest. They tracked breath by tracing constellations on their palms, Orion for steadying, the Pleiades for softening the edges of thought. They learned to map a day in 3 lines, a jagged one for friction, a wave for ease, a dotted path for the moments they weren't sure how they made it through but did. They borrowed Nora's marginal notes and added their own. Anxiety with laughter is different than anxiety without light. If the hard thing is 10 minutes long, don't give it the whole evening. Sometimes, Ezra explained to River during one of their quiet conversations after the group had dispersed, we forget that we are not just the boat trying not to capsize in the storm. We are also the water, the wind, and sometimes even the shore. River looked at him with the focused attention of someone receiving a map to territory they were still learning to navigate. The part of you that feels overwhelmed is real, but it's not the only part of you. The part that observes the storm, that notices the patterns, that knows how to find its way back to quiet harbor, that part is also real. And often it's the part we forget to listen to. Sometimes Ezra would stand a little away from the Thursday circle, near the window where the field was remembering how to be green, and feel the atmosphere in the room self-adjust. River would tip the blinds to let in more sky. Luna would set a pebble within reach of a fidgeting hand. Thea would place both palms on the piano's cool lid and count backward by sevens, not as punishment, but as a way to give his thoughts something steady to climb down. They didn't rescue one another. They companioned. The work began to travel in ways that surprised them all. Clara, the young woman who had lost her brother and found solace in the observatory's gentle presence, wrote from her hometown about starting evening gatherings by the river, where people came at dusk to sit and listen to water. She brought a thermos and a handful of stones, teaching others the simple practices she had learned: how to choose a cup, how to sketch a feeling, how to name one star as an anchor point in overwhelming darkness. Dr. Martinez's wayfinding gatherings had quietly multiplied, appearing in neighboring towns where people gathered in libraries and community centers, following the same principles Nora had established: gentle witnessing, patient presence, and the understanding that healing happens not through advice, but through the simple act of being truly seen and accepted. Harold, the mailman, had become an unofficial ambassador, carrying stories and small practices along his route, planting seeds of possibility in conversations that bloomed into support networks. On a rainy day that pressed the world into soft focus, a school counselor arrived with a small group who wore the look of people who had agreed to try something but reserved judgment. Ezra remembered Nora's advice: when newcomers arrive, let the room introduce itself before you do. He showed them the kettle, the dome, the star charts that smelled faintly of dust and old libraries. Luna offered pencils without asking anyone to draw. River placed 3 cups on the table and said nothing. It was the quiet that did the work. Not silence used like a rule, but quiet offered like a blanket. A girl named Kira, who had refused to sit, eventually leaned against a bookshelf and watched the dust drift in lamplight. "It feels different here," she said, half to herself. "My thoughts don't yell as loud." Ezra nodded as if she had named a star, and in a way she had. Once named, a thing is easier to find again. As spring ripened into summer, Ezra began keeping a small notebook, not for records but for gratitudes. To the sky for cooperating, to Nora for her notes, to the kettle for always humming the same comfort. He discovered that teaching asked him to clarify what he had only intuited before. He learned to describe the micro-movements of care, how he set a mug down a breath sooner than someone realized they wanted it, how lowering a lamp by a thumb width could persuade tears to arrive safely, how not asking a question often invited a better answer. One evening, after the Thursday circle had drifted home and the observatory was settling into its blue hour, Ezra found Luna at the back table, arranging her sketches from the past months. She had pinned them like constellations: River's compass choices, Jonah's first unclenched hand, Mina asleep in a chair with a blanket barely covering her knees, Theo's fingers relaxed over ivory keys. The drawings created a map of their small world's healing, not linear but patterned and true. "I keep thinking about Nora's sentence," Luna said, her eyes reflecting the low lamp. "We don't make flowers grow. We make room. I think these are the rooms." She gestured to the sketches. Evidence that room was made. Ezra felt something loosen and expand inside him, a recognition like dawn's first admission of color. The work was already traveling, not because they had planned it, but because good practices are like seeds in pockets. People carry them without thinking and plant them where the soil is ready. River had become a teacher without trying, simply by sharing what had helped them. The Thursday circle had become a training ground for peer support, each member learning to offer the same gentle presence they had received. As evening deepened and the first stars appeared through the dome's opening, Ezra understood that his role had refined itself again. He was still the keeper of conditions, but he had become something else too, a quiet architect of permission, a maker of pathways others could walk together. The boy who had arrived with the aurora was growing into exactly what the world needed: not someone who healed people individually, but someone who helped create the conditions where people could heal each other through the simple, revolutionary act of being genuinely present for one another's truth. The wildflower field outside held its mysterious spirals in the gathering darkness, and somewhere in the space between one breath and the next, Ezra felt Nora's presence like a gentle hand on his shoulder, reminding him that the most important work is always the work of helping others remember that they belong to something beautiful, something larger than their individual struggles, something as vast and patient and enduring as the stars themselves. Time moved through the observatory, the way healing moves through a community, gradually, then suddenly, leaving Ezra with the startling recognition that what had felt like gentle daily practice had accumulated into something approaching a life's work. The Thursday Circle had evolved into a constellation of connected practices, each one adapted to its own local conditions while maintaining the essential truth that healing happens not through expert intervention but through the patient cultivation of spaces where people can remember their own wholeness. Years had softened the sharp edges of urgency that once characterized visitors' arrivals. People came now not just during crises, but as part of their regular practice of emotional maintenance, the way others might visit a gym or library. The observatory had become what Luna began calling emotional infrastructure, as essential and quietly present as streetlights or water systems, noticed most when absent, but otherwise simply part of the landscape of care that made community life possible. River, now in their mid-20s, had established what they called weather stations in 3 neighboring cities, urban adaptations of the observatories, principles designed for teenagers who needed somewhere to go when home felt too small and the world felt too overwhelming. "We're not copying what you do here," River had explained during their last visit, their voice carrying the grounded confidence of someone who had learned to dance with their own difficult feelings. "We're translating it. City anxiety needs different tools than rural anxiety, but the underlying patterns are the same. The practices were traveling and adapting with the organic inevitability of seeds finding suitable soil." Clara's riverside gatherings had inspired similar programs along waterways across 3 states, each one modified for local customs and needs. Dr. Martinez's wayfinding circles had evolved into a loose network of peer support groups that met in community centers, church basements, and hospital break rooms, anywhere people gathered who understood that healing often happens not through advice but through the simple act of being truly witnessed. Harold, now retired from his mail route but busier than ever, had become an unofficial coordinator of what people were beginning to call the network. Not an organization exactly, but a web of communities connected by shared practices and mutual care. His pocket still jingled with sighting stones, but now he carried a small notebook filled with addresses and phone numbers, connecting people across distances who shared similar struggles or complementary wisdom. Within the observatory itself, Ezra and Luna's partnership had deepened into something that felt less like 2 separate people choosing to work together, and more like a single entity expressing itself through 2 bodies. They moved through their days with seamless synchronicity, Luna's hand lowering a lamp at the exact moment Ezra set a mug where someone's gaze would find it, his attention turning toward a visitor just as her sketch began translating their feeling into visual form. Their love story wasn't one of grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but of shared silences, knowing glances, and the profound satisfaction of building something beautiful together. When Luna began leaving small sketches tucked between Ezra's star charts, drawings of his hands as he worked, the way light fell across his face during evening observations, he understood these as love letters written in the language. They both spoke fluently, the vocabulary of careful attention and tender witness. The observatory itself had aged gracefully under their care, settling into its role as what visitors often described as the heart of the heart work. The building seemed to breathe with accumulated peace, the kind of atmosphere that takes decades to cultivate and can be felt the moment someone crosses the threshold. New visitors would often pause just inside the door and exhale deeply, as if their nervous systems had suddenly remembered what safety felt like. Luna's feeling maps had evolved into something approaching a visual language, symbols and patterns that helped people recognize their own emotional weather systems with the same clarity they might read a barometric chart. Her latest series showed not individual journeys, but the interconnected web of healing that had grown from the observatory, lines of connection stretching across counties and states, each one representing someone who had learned to create conditions for healing in their own community. "I keep thinking about what Nora used to say," Luna said one evening, as they arranged her newest sketches on the wall. "We don't make flowers grow. We make room." "I think we've been making room for something much larger than we imagined." Ezra studied the drawings, a visual map of how care had learned to travel from one heart to another, how practices had adapted to local conditions while maintaining their essential spirit. He could see River's urban weather stations, Clara's riverside gatherings, Dr. Martinez's hospital breakroom circles, Harold's informal network of stone carriers. Each point of light represented not just a place, but a way of being that honored both individual sovereignty and collective responsibility. Letters continued to arrive from unexpected places, each one carrying news of how the practices were taking root in new soil. A teacher in Vermont had started feeling weather check-ins with her students. A social worker in New Mexico was using Luna's mapping techniques to help families visualize their patterns of conflict and connection. A group of retirees in Florida had established Gentle Tuesdays weekly, gatherings where people could practice the art of being present for each other's stories without offering advice or solutions. "Sometimes I wonder if this is what the Aurora was preparing us for," Ezra mused one evening as they stood in the field where he'd been found 35 years earlier. The mysterious wildflower spirals lay quiet under winter's blanket, but their patterns remained visible in the stubble, a reminder that some things persist through every season, not just to create one sanctuary, but to plant seeds that would grow into a forest of sanctuaries. As the year turned and the aurora forecast began its familiar whispers of possibility, Ezra felt himself settling into a new understanding of his purpose. The boy who had arrived with the aurora had become something he could never have anticipated, not just a keeper of a single sacred space, but a catalyst for a quiet revolution in how people understood and supported each other's emotional well-being. The network of connected communities had grown organically, without formal leadership or institutional structure, held together by shared practices and mutual care, rather than rules or hierarchies. It was exactly what the world needed, a way of being together that created space for healing without trying to control its direction or timeline, that honored the wisdom already present in every human heart, while providing gentle tools for accessing that wisdom more readily. On quiet evenings when the observatory held only them and the gentle hum of accumulated peace, Ezra would sometimes walk out to the field and feel the presence of everyone who had ever found comfort within these walls. Everyone who had carried the practices forward to their own communities, everyone who was at that very moment sitting with someone else's pain and offering the simple gift of patient witness. The mystery of his arrival had never been solved, but it no longer needed to be. The aurora had brought him exactly where he needed to be, to learn exactly what the world needed him to teach, that healing spreads naturally when it's given permission to move through communities like water finding its course, like seeds carried on wind, like love learning to recognize itself in the patient care one human being offers another. As winter deepened and the first hints of another extraordinary night began to whisper through the aurora forecast, Ezra understood that his life's work was entering its most profound phase. The practices had taken root, the network was self-sustaining, and the next generation of spaceholders was already emerging. Soon it would be time for the final lesson, not about creating or maintaining, but about the gentle art of letting go, trusting that what had been planted with love would continue to grow in ways he could never control or predict. The wildflower spirals lay quiet under their blanket of snow, but somewhere in winter's patient darkness, he could feel them preparing for another season of impossible beauty. Another reminder that some gifts arrive not because we understand them, but because we're willing to receive them with open hearts and hands, ready to share whatever abundance they bring. The seasons wove themselves into Ezra's hair like silver threads catching lamplight, each strand a quiet testament to the decades of gentle witnessing he had offered to hearts learning to trust their own capacity for healing. Time moved through the observatory the way wisdom moves through a community. Gradually, then suddenly, leaving him with the startling recognition that what had felt like daily practice had accumulated into something approaching a completed song, though the final notes were still finding their way to the surface. He spent longer periods in contemplation now, not from weariness, but from the deep listening that comes when someone has learned to hear the conversations happening between one breath and the next. The observatory held decades of accumulated peace in its timbers, the kind of atmosphere that takes lifetimes to cultivate and can be felt the moment someone crosses the threshold. New visitors would often pause just inside the door and exhale deeply, as if their nervous systems had suddenly remembered what sanctuary felt like. Luna moved beside him with the unhurried synchronicity of two streams that had learned to braid themselves into a single current. Her hair now held its own silver threads, and her sketches had evolved into something she called memory landscapes, drawings that showed how love and loss, joy and sorrow wove together to form the rich, textured terrain of a life lived fully. Their partnership had deepened into something that felt less like two people choosing to work together, and more like a single heart, expressing itself through two bodies, each anticipating the other's needs, with the natural grace of seasons changing. The network of connected communities had grown beyond what any single map could hold, spreading through the organic channels that carry all meaningful change, one conversation at a time, one shared practice traveling from pocket to pocket like seeds on the wind. Letters arrived from impossible distances, each one carrying news of how the practices were taking root in new soil. A teacher in Vermont had started feeling weather check-ins with her students. A group of retirees in Florida had established Gentle Tuesdays. Rivers, urban weather stations had inspired rooftop gatherings where teenagers learned the 3 cups practice and taught it to younger siblings. Ezra began a practice that felt like the natural evolution of Nora's marginal notes and Luna's feeling maps. He wrote letters to anonymous travelers, not to specific people, but to whoever might need a quiet word of encouragement. Small slips of paper tucked into library books, left on park benches, slipped under stones along hiking trails. Each one was a gentle invitation to notice the extraordinary tenderness within ordinary moments. The world is always speaking to us, if we remember how to listen with our hearts. Your grief has its own perfect rhythm. Do not rush it, nor hold it back. The Thursday circles had evolved under River's gentle guidance, with Mina and Theo and Jonah returning as peer mentors, each carrying the particular wisdom that comes from learning to dance with one's own difficult feelings. They moved through the observatory with quiet confidence, offering the same patient presence they had once received, creating the conditions where new visitors could discover their own capacity for healing. Harold, now carrying a wooden box of sighting stones instead of mail, had become an unofficial coordinator of what people called the network. Not an organization exactly, but a web of communities connected by shared practices and mutual care. His pocket still jingled with smooth stones, but now he carried stories too, connecting people across distances who shared similar struggles or complementary wisdom. Dr. Martinez brought residents from the hospital to learn the art of gentle witnessing, teaching them that a soft shoulder could stabilize a whole room, that facing the window let the horizon do some of the work. May, the violinist, had established what they called night lullabies, unannounced evenings when music would simply begin and whoever needed it would find their way in. As autumn deepened and the aurora forecast began its familiar whispers of possibility, Ezra felt something shifting in the quality of attention around him, not ending, but completing itself, like a song that had found all its necessary verses and was preparing to reveal its final, inevitable chorus. Visitors spoke of dreams, where all the scattered practices appeared as points of light, connected by invisible threads into a vast constellation that was finally becoming visible. The wildflower field lay quiet under winter's approach, but the spiral patterns remained visible in the stubble, like secret handwriting that had learned to persist through every season. Standing there at dusk, feeling the accumulated weight of 4 decades of gentle work, Ezra understood that his arrival with the aurora had been the first note in a long composition about the healing power of loving attention. Every person who had found comfort within these walls, every practice that had traveled to distant communities, every moment of patient witness, all of it had been preparing for something larger than he could have imagined. he was learning the deepest lesson of all, that the most profound fulfillment comes not from holding on to what we've created, but from trusting it, to continue growing in ways we could never control or predict. The boy who had arrived with impossible lights was becoming something the world had always needed, not someone who healed people individually, but someone who had helped create the conditions where people could heal each other through the simple, revolutionary act of being genuinely present for one another's truth. And somewhere in winter's patient darkness, he could feel the final movement of his life's symphony beginning to stir, preparing to reveal how all the separate melodies of care and connection would resolve into something larger and more beautiful than any single voice could have sung alone. The final movement revealed itself the way all the most profound changes in Ezra's life had arrived, quietly, with a shift in the atmosphere so gentle that only those who had learned to listen with their whole beings would recognize it as the approach of completion. Time had woven silver threads through his hair like tiny constellations, each strand a quiet testament to the decades of patient witnessing he had offered to hearts learning to trust their own capacity for healing. He spent longer periods in contemplation now, not from weariness, but from the deep listening that comes when someone has learned to hear the conversations happening between one breath and the next. The observatory held decades of accumulated peace in its timbers, the kind of atmosphere that takes lifetimes to cultivate and can be felt the moment someone crosses the threshold. The building itself seemed to breathe with self-sustaining warmth, no longer requiring his constant tending, but simply his presence, like a garden that has learned to tend itself. Luna moved beside him with the unhurried synchronicity of two streams that had learned to braid themselves into a single current. Her hair now held its own silver threads, and her memory landscapes filled the walls, drawings that showed not just individual journeys but the vast, interconnected web of healing that had grown from their shared work. Their love story had deepened into something that felt less like two people choosing to work together, and more like a single heart expressing itself through two bodies, each anticipating the other's needs with the natural grace of seasons changing. The network of connected communities had grown beyond what any single map could hold, spreading through the organic channels that carry all meaningful change, one conversation at a time, one shared practice traveling from pocket to pocket like seeds on the wind. River's urban weather stations pulsed like gentle stars across multiple cities. Clara's riverside gatherings had inspired similar programs along waterways in distant states. Dr. Martinez's wayfinding circles had become fundamental, parts of grief support in hospitals and community centers. Harold, now carrying stories instead of mail, connected people across impossible distances who shared similar struggles or complementary wisdom. As the Aurora forecast began its familiar whispers of possibility, word traveled through the network with the organic speed of significant news. People began arriving as they had during that first extraordinary night of beautiful confusion, drawn not by formal invitations, but by instincts deeper than conscious thought. River came with young people who had learned the 3 cups practice and carried it like medicine to urban corners where healing was desperately needed. Dr. Martinez brought colleagues who had discovered that presence could be more powerful than any prescription. May arrived with her violin and instruments for anyone who wanted to add their voice to whatever music the night might create. When the Aurora returned, it did so with the gentle inevitability of a song reaching its final chorus. The lights emerged as luminous threads weaving themselves into patterns that felt both foreign and familiar. But this time they seemed to be responding to the gathering below rather than simply performing above it. Under this luminous canopy, the same beautiful confusion that had visited years before settled over them, deeper now, more integrated, as if the community had learned how to hold such profound openness safely. Ezra moved among the gathering with quiet grace, but tonight his role had evolved from conductor to witness. He could feel the practices taking on their own life, creating a web of mutual support that stretched far beyond his ability to guide or contain. At one point he did something unusual. He stepped back. Not dramatically, but with a small recalibration, like moving a single inch to reveal someone else's view. River noticed first and shifted forward naturally, offering the 3 cups practice to a newcomer with the same quiet assurance that had once steadied their own trembling hands. Luna's sketches captured not individual healing, but the moment when all the separate streams of care converged into something larger than their sum. The room made itself and the room kept itself exactly as Nora had always known it would. Standing in the field where he'd been found 50 years earlier, surrounded by people who had learned to create conditions for healing in their own communities, Ezra felt something unclench deep within, a release that was less like letting go and more like letting be. He understood that his arrival with the Aurora had been the first note in a symphony about the transformative power of patient witness, and now that symphony was completing itself in ways more beautiful than he could have imagined. The mystery of his beginning had never been solved, but it no longer needed to be. The lights had brought him exactly where he needed to be, to learn exactly what the world needed him to teach, that healing spreads naturally when it's given permission to move through communities like water, finding its course, like love learning to recognize itself in the gentle care one human being offers another. As dawn approached and the Aurora began its gentle retreat, Luna appeared beside him, her hand finding his with the natural ease of water finding its level. Around them, the gathering continued its quiet celebration of connection, people carrying the night's wisdom back to their own communities, like seeds in their pockets, ready to plant new gardens of care wherever the soil was ready. "The work will continue," Luna whispered, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had watched seeds become forests, in ways we can't imagine, in places we'll never see. Ezra squeezed her fingers gently, feeling the truth settle in his bones like starlight finding its way through familiar windows. He had learned the deepest lesson of all, that the most profound fulfillment comes not from holding on to what we've created, but from trusting it to continue growing in ways we could never control or predict. In his final years, he spent more time simply observing, letting the world wash over him with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had grown completely into their purpose. The wildflower spirals continued their annual blooming in impossible colors, and he would sit among them understanding that some patterns persist through every season, waiting patiently for the right moment to bloom again. One evening, as the Aurora danced in soft whispers across the sky, echoing the night of his arrival, Ezra sat by the observatory window, with Luna's hand resting gently in his. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her touch, the quiet hum of the building, and the distant familiar rhythm of the cosmos. His breathing softened, becoming one with the gentle pulse of the night, and somewhere in the space between one breath and the next, he simply settled deeper into the listening that had always held him. The observatory continued its gentle work, the dome tracking its slow arc across star-filled skies. People kept arriving and leaving, learning the ancient practice of making room and handing it forward like warm bread. The network of care continued to grow and spread, touching lives in ways that would ripple forward through generations. And somewhere, in the field where impossible flowers bloom in spirals that mirror the dance of distant stars, you can still feel it, the way the air leans closer as if to hear you better, the way the night holds space for whatever needs to be witnessed. On certain evenings, when the sky remembers how to dance, you might see a small sandwich placed on a windowsill and hear a kettle murmur like a lullaby, reminding you that we belong to each other, that healing is patient and that love learns over and over how to hold whatever comes. And with that, he stretched into the stars, becoming part of the vast, gentle network of light that holds all things together. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.